Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's last session block for the Research Libraries Conference here today. I'm happy to present today's session for Brigade, how NYPL's regimental history collection is a testament to our colleagues from the greatest generation. We thank you all for joining us. Please note there is an option at the bottom of your screen to turn on live captions if needed. Also, this session is being recorded and will be available after the conference. Before we get started, let me just introduce myself. My name is Joanne Wong, and I work at the Stephen A. Schwarzman Building. Today, I will be facilitating the session and will be acting as moderator. So I'll be keeping an eye on both the time as well as any comments or questions that are coming in from the chat. This session itself will be following a presentation format. During the program, feel free to use the chat function to share general comments and/or questions. Make sure that you change your chat mode, though, to panelist and attendee so that everyone is included in the conversation and question. We are going to save questions for the end of the session, so just keep that in mind. But once again, you can use the chat function as a way to share those questions in advance, or we will and we can collect them at the end of the session. Now, for our presenter today, our presenter is Daniel Anger, who is a collections processing assistant on the Research Libraries Special Projects team. Hailing from Pompton Plains, Daniel previously studied in England and Galilee before moving to a small island east of New Jersey in 2022. And on that note, I'll let Daniel take it from here.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a rich, wonderful conference, and I just want to start out with a word of thanks to Joanne and to the programming committee. And just in particular, the Public Services Committee did so much for this conference, but they also do so much for really linking together our community across research libraries throughout the year. It's been such a rich conference, and I'm honored to join you all today. Just double checking that my slide works. So you should be seeing my usual first view of the library is I start work in SASB around 8 in the morning before most of the patrons. And generally what I do is working on the Google Books team and the special projects team, where I get a deep look at the collections of the library and the library's history in a way that other people might have a harder time accessing. Generally, my view of the library, I feel like I'm diving for pearls in the stacks. My mission is to catalog, conserve, and digitize material from our collections and make them available to as wide a variety of people as possible. Most of our work is really behind the scenes. So while sometimes I see, the main beautiful reading rooms, a lot of time my view is slightly different. It's in the stacks underneath Bryant Park, at our research centers, and at ReCap. And this is where you really feel like you're diving for pearls. You're in a maze. You're really, if you think of the library's collections as water, some people are fishing and I'm scuba diving. Much of our work is behind the scenes, but our efforts allow for the library's collections to be accessed in ways that were really impossible beforehand. Besides digitizing, we also work I've worked under the direction of Rudina Hikaleri and Evelyn Belger for most of my time here, and I'm so grateful for having them as role models and friends who are also my boss. Besides the Google Books project, we work on copy cataloging and processing the library's extensive pamphlet volume collection. And this is material that ranges from the Renaissance to right around World War II. And much of the material that we process is in different languages, it's in different formats, alphabets that are hard to recognize at times. And it can be slightly tedious and very behind the scenes. But personally, one of my most rewarding moments at the library was going to the Esther and Age of Rembrandt exhibit at the Met and seeing one of the pamphlet volumes that my team cataloged that we thought would never really go on display because, it's from the Netherlands from the 1600s. And seeing that it had a place of honor next to Rembrandt paintings. And it's funny, we joked that, we need to do a really good job cataloging this because no one will look at it for 100 years. And then seeing how quickly it was used after we cataloged it was extremely gratifying for us. So it's in this deep dive of the collections that I came across the subject of my talk. which are regimental histories. Um, and really the first moment I remember clearly that I came across it was seeing a title that I'll reference a few times called Borneo Burlesque. And the title and the cartoon with the island of Borneo in a little loincloth really stood out to me. But this was one of quickly, I would see thousands of what are called regimental histories. The other picture is one from World War One. And particularly with this year being the 80th anniversary of World War II, of the Allied victory, I really fell into the most delightful bunny trail of learning more about this collection, how it got here, and more importantly, the librarians and colleagues from World War II at the library who made incredible sacrifices for our country. So let me just define what a regimental history is. So it is a memoir written by, for, and about specific groups of soldiers. And one definition that I would like to read is just a little introduction from one of our regimental histories. It says the catastrophe of war, which now and then descends upon civilization, is of such overwhelming magnitude that the individual is completely lost in its maze. Much of the lonely, soul-consuming pathos that is a part of every war becomes lost with the years. The drab and endless days of waiting, hoping, cursing, crying lose their piercing sting. The wounds that are suffered in every heart heal, and only the scarred tissues remain. The dirt and grime, the stench of rotting flesh are soon forgotten, and only the brilliant strategical victory of a mighty army are left for its posterity. This story has endeavored to trace the odyssey of an infantry signal company through its days of combat, moments of glory and victory, humor and pathos, which every individual came to know. When the newspapers flashed the news of the great feat which was accomplished by the crossing of the Rhine River over the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, it failed to record how dreadfully some men suffered in that operation. It wasn't important to the world what a GI felt as he crept across that bridge and saw a dead captain lying against the railing with his mouth hanging open, or how his stomach tied in knots at the sight of a toasted Jeep driver sitting in a smoldering vehicle. But to the men who fought this, the events that were important to them were the multitude of little things that were a part of their daily living. That dead captain and the Jeep driver are the product of war, which will always be remembered by the men who were there. So it is with this purpose in mind, to relate to the multitude of little things, that this history of the 78th Infantry Division was written. So what really drew me into this collection of materials is that it's primarily written by veterans for veterans. It was focused on the personal history and the memoirs and the stories and the jokes and the tears shared together. It wasn't meant to, it wasn't like one of those monuments to wars you see at the Met, like an ancient Egyptian pharaoh telling about his victories. It was the personal people in the trenches together, focusing on their friendship. Um, this highlight from Borneo Burlesque that is, I quoted here in italics, of just highlighting how these are memorials to friendships made in adversity, and how really these shared trials together formed deep friendships that and deep hope in the midst of really bleak stuff, difficult times. So how do we find these collections in the NYPL? This is the catalogers in our midst, I think, would be excited about this as well, of how there's, many of them were initially purchased by the library in the 1940s and 1950s. They were cataloged under Billings. And many of the subject headings, I think, have potential to be made even more accessible to patrons. So most of the subject headings might be regimental history, World War II, United States. It'll be, the subject term will be the country that the regiment was from. But I think there's real room for more precision in searching by adding additional subject fields for the theater of war that they were in. So it's not just World War II, United States 409th Regiment. It would be Burma or Myanmar or Guadalcanal, places where the major activity in war took place. So many people who want to know about, the war in the Netherlands are looking for pictures of soldiers in Egypt or Libya, but they might not know what regiment was in Libya at that time. So just sticking to World War II, the NYPL has around at least 7,000 print books and microfilms of regimental histories from World War II alone. And many of these were really rare books. They were printed by the soldiers for the soldiers. So honestly, more often than not, there's around 500 or so copies of a book, and maybe there's two or three in libraries in the United States, particularly for regimental histories from Australia and New Zealand as well, which often can be the most richly illustrated. And this is an example of some of these histories are really rather richly illustrated. And you can see by the captions in the photos that these weren't necessarily meant for, National Geographic or sending to your general back in DC. Looking at some of these captions, you really just wonder, you just get hints of the people who served. They're incredibly poignant and personal, and they're critical to a term of restorative narrative of how we highlight voices that are lost over time. You see a picture. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer on the screen, but there's one of nicknamed two people named Horse and Daisy who were overseas too long with no other description of who they were or what their relationship was. There was a man nicknamed, this is from a regimental history in present day Myanmar, of Mike named Hobo, who sounds like an all out all star who was rather messy but really beloved. There was a soldier named Oscar McGee who trained a local monkey to drink alcohol, and the monkey really loved drinking alcohol. These little stories and humorous vignettes and sad vignettes really leave a mark on you when you go through this collection. One funny trend I also noticed is that many Australians didn't really care much about clothing, especially if they were in tropical conflicts like Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The picture on the right of my screen is from Desert Sand and Jungle Green. And one quote that I thought was rather funny was a big wig general was coming into the camp, and the local staff were running around just making sure, saying, "The general's in town, make sure you all have pants on," which obviously, with the photos you see, most of the time they didn't when they were off duty. But just a reflection of how laid back people were and how humid and hot and tricky the jungle climate was. One other little vignette I wanted to highlight that I discovered through regimental histories are little, just you see the emotion of the war channeled in how people took care of their pets. So this is Smokey, who is a Yorkie Doodle Dandy, who was discovered by American soldiers in Papua New Guinea. Now, for those of us who are near the Stephen A. Schwartzman building, Smokey's parachute and little jumpsuit outfit are on display at the American Kennel Club. And Smokey's story, and really the story of how a group of soldiers survived the war in a very difficult environment, really is just a beautiful story of finding hope in really intense, painful fronts in the war. Um, Apparently, Smokey's only disobedience was having puppies at the wrong moment in the conflict. That was not up to military behavior, but other than that, in this photo op, she was put in a parachute and they climbed a tree and threw her off the tree. They didn't send her out of a plane in that, but for the picture, it looks like she's a full-blown soldier. Now I wanted to highlight a little bit more about Borneo burlesque and about just the emotions that drew me into learning more about this connection. Um, Borneo burlesque documents the life of Australian prisoners of war and British prisoners of war in a prison camp in Borneo during World War II. And it highlights the power of having hope in something that is outside of your circumstances. Prison camps in Borneo had a very wide range of mortality rates, but they were quite severe. Some prison camps, most of the people survived. Other prison camps had a 99% mortality rate. And in the midst of this really soul-crushing environment, starvation, sickness, of being in the jungle with little to no food or medical support or even roofs over their head, these group of Australian soldiers uh, put on Shakespeare plays in the jungle with little more than coconut leaves and grass skirts. They made choirs. They taught classes to one another with only the things that they had in their brain. If you separated me from my smartphone or from my book bag for more than a day or two, I'm not sure how I would be. But I was really struck by how well furnished these men and women, their minds were, that they would be plucked and separated from everything that was familiar to them, but yet they formed this community that sustained each other with hope and joy and humor in the face of death. And there was just one excerpt from a description of the really the underground Christmas concert that was put on by Claude Pickford in this group. And he said, to interest-starved war prisoners, however, the play meant 90 minutes of transportation from their miserable existence into another world. So within the whole history of regimental histories, there's a subgroup that really fascinates me, and those are the creative lives of people who are in prison and people prisoners of war. And I'm really just inspired by this collection at the library and the legacy and testimony of these really brave, creative individuals who continue to hope, continue to dream, and continue to study in the face of what felt like insurmountable odds. These are some of the excerpts of the play posters and the pictures and the notes from Borneo Burlesque. There were people who smuggled in little pieces of trash. They made, the back of toilet paper and little bits and pieces of rubbish that they turned into posters and notebooks and things to utilize their education for. Um, these prison camps and long periods of being in the army for many people were crucibles of creativity. The library has some writings by Eva Herman, who was a prisoner of war. I'm sorry, she was in a concentration camp in Germany, and she was a Quaker, and many of her fellow inmates were of different traditions within Christianity, and they were separated from everything they had. But one prisoner would have this psalm memorized. Eva would have this psalm memorized. They would teach each other the prayers that they had learned in their various places of worship and spurred one another on to hope and to grow in just really desperate, sad, terrible times. Within these painful moments in history, there are also moments for great humor and creativity. Uh, the Australians in Borneo managed to grow orchids in the prison camp. They taught each other different languages and they wrote lessons down on scrap paper. One of my more favorite moments was the difficulty they had in a very macho environment finding men who would play female leads in romance plays like Romeo and Juliet. One excerpt that I thought rather funny was this quote about a Shakespeare play. Difficulty had been experienced up to date in finding a suitable type to play the feminine roles called for in different plays. The main standby had been Lieutenant Peck. Other officers were very hard to convince that they could imitate a woman on the stage. This was not without reason, for the average army type is definitely not beautiful or even graceful. Forbes allowed himself to be persuaded by the combined eloquence of Rowell and Dranny take on the feminine part in a mystery thriller. Thereafter, he spent agonizing odd hours trying to talk like a woman, and worst of all, to walk in a pair of very high-heeled shoes that had been ingeniously constructed for Lieutenant Peck. A pair of coconut shells made a bosom that brought gasps of comment from the audience. When the show had finished, Forbes made a vow that he had acted his first and last feminine role. Within the midst of all this uh, deep suffering and deep pain and executions by the occupying soldiers, they found these moments to be human, these moments to form community that fueled them with hope that ultimately helped lead to their survival. So what the big lesson learned that I had engaging with this collection is that of defiant joy, of laughing, singing, creating, and praying in the face of fear. I'm reminded a little bit of Joy's opening today, where she said to double down means to go back into finding the thing in your calling that refreshes you and gives you joy, no matter what your situation is. I'm also reminded of John Milton's quote that the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven out of hell and a hell out of heaven. Viktor Frankl, whose memoir of his survival in Auschwitz, Man's Search for Meaning, is one of the probably the most moving books I've ever read, describes this feeling as well. He said, "We who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they can offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The picture on this slide is from one of my favorite books that I found in the library. It's Desert Sand and Jungle Green. And because we're in New York, I have to include our mascot animal, which is a rat. The At least I feel that's Pizza Rat is my mascot animal in New York. Um, the the soldiers in this book were besieged by General Rommel and the German and Italian forces in the city of Tobruk in present-day Libya. And if this city fell, the Suez Canal, which connected their home in Australia to the European front, would be wide open for the Axis takeover. And things really looked grim. And William Joyce, who was basically the German version of Tokyo Rose, he was originally from Brooklyn and then served as a propaganda minister for the Nazis, said that they were cornered and besieged by an undefeated army, and they were cornered like rats. Now, when the men in Tobruk heard this, they decided, well, we'll fight like rats, and took they made these beautiful little cartoons of swashbuckling rats holding machine guns and kind of leaning and swaggering, and they dug deep and defeated Rommel and survived to laugh about this. And unofficially, they became known throughout the war as the Rats of Tobruk. And this laughter in the face of fear and in death is incredibly inspiring. So now that I've given a summary of this collection, I'm going to pivot and talk about how exactly this collection came into the library. And particularly to me, I feel the most meaningful part of the collection is how the really how the library and the staff of the library were shaped by the World War I and World War II. Okay, so these are the image on the left is from one of the major initiatives that the NYPL took part in of bringing books to soldiers on the front, and the poster with the quote from Franklin Roosevelt about books cannot be killed by fire, but it's really the ideas. The ideas that books contain are, why wars are fought, and ultimately no tyranny can completely silence an idea. Really reflect how pivotal and central the library was for the front. Really, New York City was kind of the front door to the world of New York, from the U.S. to the world, and still is. Hundreds of NYPL staff were drafted and volunteered for the war and for the United States during World War One. If you go through staff news and resources in the archives, you'll find really poignant one or two sentences highlighting certain staff. I think Dorothy Stockford, who is from a branch in the Bronx, could have her own Hallmark movie. She left the New York Public Library to volunteer as a librarian at Fort Dix and wrote a little note saying that she fell in love and married a soldier at Fort Dix. Carl Koop, who is responsible for some of our greatest acquisitions in the Spencer collection, he before World War II was and still is known as an incredible linguist. He traveled through much of Asia around 5 times, even in 1940. And then when the US entered the war, he was drafted for his language ability. But as the war clouds were really covering the world, he wrote to a colleague in Tokyo in March of 1941. This is a colleague, Shigeo Soramachi, who, along with Coop, really helped build the Japanese collection at the library. He said to Soramachi that the main thing is that we do not lose sight of each other, even though I shan't be able to come back to Tokyo so soon. And then after the war, after Coop had served, and after I believe Soramachi's bookstore was burned down and rebuilt, they continued with their relationship to build this collection together. Focusing more on the branches, there's a really poignant moment where many of the janitors who lived in the branch libraries, who had children who were born and raised in the library, to quote their term, the library would note when each of these library children were drafted to fight. The monument men were based in the Frick Library, for much of the cultural research, but we also should remember that much of the strategic intelligence for the United States was centered at Rockefeller Center and made use of the NYPL's map division. And really the map division came into its own because of the great need for geographic information that started in World War II. Alice Hudson, the longtime curator of the map and chief of the map division, really did some groundbreaking research and documenting how important the map division was to World War II. And she's quoted in an amazing book called The Book at War by Andrew Pettigrew. But really, there were moments where the NYPL was to the forefront of World War II for the United States, because while the Library of Congress also had a major map collection, they were more focused on cataloging American maps, maps of the soybean fields in Kansas, while at the time the NYPL was much more focused on cataloging maps of the world. And this proper cataloging and this global reach of collecting, to quote a contemporary of the time, was a matter of life and death. As we were sending our young men and women to remote islands in the South Pacific, oftentimes the NYPL was one of the few places that had information needed to make life or death decisions. This was a time when generals were still looking at maps of Europe with a Baedeker travel guide. They didn't have anything else, was really a coin flip of whether or not they had these type of things. Going to a more personal level of the library are letters from staff who were drafted overseas back to the library. It's really hard to state how, and this screen here is a copy I found in the archives of just a joke of, as the NYPL was preparing for bomb drills and fired emergency sirens, of things you should really not do in case of an emergency evacuation of the central library. But it's really hard to imagine how focused and united the staff in this building were towards the war effort. Librarians have never made a lot of money, they never will. But they really were incredibly generous in World War II from the ground up, of buying war bonds, of making sure people were taken care of remembering their friends and colleagues who were drafted or volunteered for service. And one of the most poignant moments of this, and one of the few documents we have of our staff from that time, are the results of generosity of librarians. It wasn't necessarily from top-down leadership, but it was from the bottom up, of how the first Christmas of the war in 1942 and 1943, librarians gathered together their resources and gathered all the addresses of the people who were spread all across the US and got enough money to get a New Yorker magazine, some candy, some dice, and some toiletries, and a little note and a copy of the staff news. And they sent it to all the people who, at this time, it were around 300 former library employees who were drafted. And you'll see in the manuscripts, archives, and rare books, this beautifully bound notebook containing many, many different thank you letters. I think it must be probably around 200 thank you letters written by staff to the librarians here. And this isn't really the only, there's still thank you letters that we still find today. While I was processing the Google Books project, I found a postcard that was a bookmark that was another thank you letter from a World War II staff member who was serving in the front in North Africa, and he wrote it to his colleagues in Staff 6. And that was a really, it almost felt like a sacred moment of finding this piece of history that I care so deeply about randomly in a book that I was digitizing. And let it be known for the record, I'm still trying to find a good home for this piece of NYPL history. So if anyone from the different departments has a recommendation, I'd be all ears to hear that. Some of these thank you letters really are the only link in the chain I have to some service members that really piqued my curiosity. And there's also in the staff news these little highlights of people who I can't really find their picture or really any information about them, because I don't have their, I have the access to these people as a list of names of librarians who served. I don't have like their birth and death records. I don't have that part of human resources yet. But one letter really encapsulates, one paragraph really encapsulates the toll of the war that went on them. Many of the NYPL staff who were drafted served in the southern front of the war in the invasion of Italy. And Glenn Clift wrote in 1943 that, "You see, it was like this. I came in with the third wave, just like the other boys. It was around 4:30, not quite daylight. How it was, I was dug in on the beach, and there was a lieutenant there beside me in that slit trench. The lieutenant noticed one of the assault boats had been hit by an enemy artillery shell. Soldiers were jumping out into the water over the sides and out over the ramp. It was down. Some of the boys were on fire. The boat was facing me, and I saw an arm waving for help on the floor of the boat. The first thing that came into my mind was that if that was me out there, I would want someone to come after me. Uh, so you see the whole range of human emotion, from thank yous for sending Christmas candy to complaints of boredom over endless laundry drills in training camps in Louisiana to really moments of in life or death. And you see trickles of that sent back to the library. One slight detour I would like to make are just a few of these thank you notes that I'd be happy to share slides more of. But in my research, particularly, I was trying to highlight NYPL staff members who were killed in action in World War I and World War II. And for the most part, I was just disappointed in not quite finding the silver bullet of I wish I could find more pictures or more information about these people. But in the manuscripts and archives collection, I found some handwritten letters of the people who served. And that was such a special moment of finally finding a little information about someone who previously was just a name with a star on the World War II memorial in the lobby of SASB. And this one letter here, I think, really captures the mood of many of our former colleagues who were drafted. He says, "Your Christmas box arrived today and is treasured not only because it says Merry Christmas, but more especially since it means from this spot on the globe, you still belong to us. And I can assure you that those words are very good to hear. I would very much like to show my gratitude by giving you some picture of what my present life is like, but about all I can really say is that I am here, without telling you where here is that I am enjoying what I am doing with no hint of what that is, and that I am well, which means the same in military as in civilian life. The rest will have to wait, but in meanwhile, sincerely, Robert E. Kingsley." This also harkens back to why I think regimental histories are so important. Because regimental histories were written for that internal audience right after the war, much of the censorship that went back to letters from home during the war or in the official military histories of World War II is lost. You really see the intimate highs and lows that these men and women have endured and suffered through together. I want to make a quick little detour to World War I, and that really can be its own entire lecture in its own book. And in fact, a book has been written about Adelaide Haas, who is one of the librarians who served at the library during World War I. I just wanted to highlight William Berthold Behrens, who worked in the predecessor of today's science, business, and industry divisions. He was in the the Stephen A. Schwarzman building. Uh, I'm really interested in both Behrens and Haas, who were both of German background in a time when many German cultural institutions and publications and media were really facing jingoistic and xenophobic headwinds in the English-speaking world. Um, Behrens wanted to be a missionary in China. He was 26. He worked at the library for 10 years. He was the first NYPL staff member, to my knowledge, who was killed in action in the war. In a very terse sentence in a funeral obituary, it was mentioned how his gas mask was found shot off his face, which just shows the amount of suffering that he went through and his division went through on the front in France. Robert Chevet also was an NYPL staff member who died in the line of duty in World War I. I'm still researching more about his life. Adelaide Haas did not serve in the front. She was a civilian. She was one of the foremost leaders, female leaders in librarianship at the turn of the 20th century. And she faced some stiff headwinds for being a single woman, a Jewish woman, and a German woman at a time when the leadership of the United States was still very Anglo-Saxon and male. She was ultimately let go from her position, and instead of going to HR, her supervisors went to the Secret Service and accused her of being a spy. Now, there's been a whole 200-page book written on Adelaide's life and her going through archives of various institutions she worked at. Most of the evidence seems to be that there was some racism and sexism involved in her letting her go, and she was also passionate about librarianship, but the FBI still has around 5 pages of material that they have not redacted to researchers. So much of her story still could be updated with material that's at the National Archives. back to World War One, back to World War Two. Just pardon me with my slide. Uh, I wanted to highlight two colleagues who really left a mark on my research and sorry, okay, pardon my delay of the slides, who left a mark on my research and who really inspire me. Uh, the man in the, Charles Dornbush, without his work and without his collection building, this talk wouldn't be possible. Charles Dornbush served at the library for many years. He was in collections and acquisitions, and his research on military history and his passion for the subject is the reason we have this collection. He spent around 30 years at the library and then went on in retirement to help found the Greene County Historical Society in upstate New York. Dornbush was a passionate military historian focused on the Civil War, and his letter in the as if he wrote a thank you to the library for receiving the Christmas gift. And we also forget that for a year or two before many people went to the front, they were in training camps in the American South, which coming from New York City might as well be your overseas. Dornbush wrote coming from New York City to Louisiana, where he spent all day washing the laundry for thousands of soldiers, shows quite a sacrifice in how much work and effort and interruption it was to be drafted. One thing to note, two of the NYPL staff members who died in World War II actually died in accidents in these training camps. So it was rigorous and severe and stretching. And it's an element of the war that's so easy to gloss over when we go straight to D-Day. Florence Mendham is an inspiration, and it shows that not all service is on the front lines. Mendham was a librarian in Yorkville. She was Jewish herself, and she was in a very large German-speaking community. Florence's family were also from Germany. And outside of library hours, Florence served as a spy. She infiltrated prominent American Nazi movements and sent her findings and her reports back to both Jewish advocacy organizations and several other organizations that were meant to really awaken the world to the threat posed by Nazi Germany. Despite Florence's heroic efforts and deep risks to her own safety, she was not able to save family members who were still in Berlin from the Holocaust. And Florence's papers are held by the Center for Jewish History. Charles Dornbush's papers are held in the historical society he founded in upstate New York, and even Carl Koop's papers. Many of them are housed in the National Art Museum and the Smithsonian. It's an interesting thing to know. With every institution, there's the phrase in the Bible that a prophet is not honored in his own hometown. Many of the stories of the NYPL employees are often safeguarded elsewhere, particularly with the NYPL retirees oral history program. It's again going back to other talks today of how we as colleagues and staff can safeguard the history of our coworkers and the people who make the NYPL the great, amazing institution that it is. I'd like to focus the last few bits of my presentation on the men who paid the ultimate sacrifice in the war. And I'm just going to read two letters from two of the men who have stars by their names who died in World War II. The first is a letter from Edward de Simone, who fell in the front in Italy in around 1944. He wrote, "I'm sorry that I haven't acknowledged it before, but the Xmas package was received in December 1943 and gratefully received and enjoyed. I must confess that those dice have seen more action than I have. The book of cartoons has made the rounds about the barracks, and the boys received many a laugh from it. Well, I will stop here for the present as correspondence is increasing and I have quite a few letters to get off. Thanks again for the Xmas gifts and staff news, and hope to see you all soon. Edward de Simone." One other letter is from a man whose story really haunts me because I'm still hunting down more information about him. His name is Charles Hugh. "Dear friends, thank you all for making the holiday of one soldier much gayer. As you have guessed, an army post is not the most cheerful place to wait for Santa Claus down here in the red seam hills of Georgia. And such a collection of gay packages, it was wonderful. The dice have already been rolled, and I can't say that they were lucky for me. We really had to try them. It was a lot of fun unwrapping so many things, and you certainly know what we need in life in the Army. It seems like years since I left the library last April on New Year's Day, and where I'll be stationed after that is anyone's guess. The Army never considers one in their plans. My best wishes to you all, and thanks so much for the grand packages. Sincerely, Charles Hugh. Now, when Charles signed his letter, he was in a regiment that was overwhelmingly African American and that was sent to the Deep South during the height of Jim Crow. Particularly the station where he received his infantry training was a place where there were lynchings associated with the KKK. And it is very likely that Charles was an African American man from Harlem who came from the Harlem Renaissance and was plucked and sent to the Deep South and then to some of the worst fighting in the South Pacific. And really, the lack of information I have on some of these names is really whetting my appetite to try to find more to honor their service to the library and service to our country. And of these names, I just want to take a moment to really highlight them and honor them. So for World War II, the librarians and janitors and staff who were drafted and who died were John Carhuff, Elliot Carmen, Salvatore J. Cavallero, Edward de Simone, Charles Hugh, Howard Kelly, and Joseph T. Wheeler. To close my presentation, I just wanted to read one more letter from a librarian who two quick moments. One other sacrifice that is really important to mention are the refugees and immigrants who came to New York who were driven out of their lands due to the war and then who gave the best of their years to the NYPL. And one woman in the Jewish division, Zahava Seller, was a survivor of the death march in Auschwitz and then served at the Jewish division. And really, one of her inspirations to write her experiences was when a patron came to the Jewish division and who was a Holocaust denier. And Zahava, at that moment, she looked down on her tattoo and realized it was her mission to share about her story and to make sure it was never forgotten. I believe Zahava is still in Brooklyn today. She's close to a century old. I also want to read one other letter of a prisoner of war who was in the GRD in the Rosemain reading room, and he wrote to his wife and to the library, quote, that we have been rescued, and already the hardships and fears of the past weeks are taking their place in perspective of each man's own body of experience. We have food, cigarettes, freedom, and hope. Together with our fellow Americans again, we may choose what to remember and what to forget. Shall we remember the bitterness, the self-seeking, the dog-eat-dog scramble for a crust of bread engendered and cultivated by the Nazi system of enslavement, whose dying days we experienced? Can we forget the community of nationalities which prevailed in the teeth of fascist domination? The Russian who suffered beatings for helping Americans, the never-conquered Czechs who succored starving Russians, the French and Poles who smiled their welcome and sympathy along with the dusty, endless roads. Dare the world forget the debt each people owes to the other in the common victory we are winning. That was George Barnes of the 3rd Infantry Division. Again, I wanted to thank you all for joining me. I wanted to thank you for allowing me to highlight these stories that so inspire me on this 80th anniversary of World War II. And a special thank you to Public Service Council who when I reached out to them about a staff talk, they recommended that I try to do this. It's been such an honor to grow and learn doing this research project. And as we have a little time left for Q&A, I would love to almost ask you all a question of how we as current employees of the library can collaborate to safeguard our institution's rich history and the rich heritage we have of colleagues before us who spent so much time creating these collections and preserving these stories for us and future generations. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a fantastic presentation. Learned so much. Wanted to let you know that there are many thank yous, a lot of claps. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do Q&A at this moment, but just want to give a round of applause to Daniel for his wonderful presentation. Okay, so I see a number of hands, so I'm going to just start calling. So Laura, I'll let you go first with your question.
Great, thank you. Daniel, that was just so compelling and fantastic. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I wanted to ask just about how some of these materials were acquired specifically, and also the two plaques with the servicemen and women. Are those still somewhere in the building or a building somewhere?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I was muted and I wasn't muted. My bad. The It's amazing. Those plaques are right by the present day gift shop entrance, and I must have walked by them 2 or 3 years without noticing them. And then when you see the list of names, it is really, really moving. I also want to caveat that the list of names are of people who worked at the library and were then called to service. So it's not a complete list. There's many, many veterans who joined the library after, and those stories are still ones we can explore. Again, I would owe much of the collection development to Charles Dornbush, and I really am grateful for Mary and GRD for pointing me out to him as someone to research. And there are moments I think of, of collection development we have these really personal memoirs that were meant for, one, one band of brother to another, and now we're stewarding them for a much wider audience. Um, I'm particularly impressed by the NYPL's collection of regimental histories from Australia and New Zealand and Russia and places outside of the US. And in many cases, we're the only library in the Western Hemisphere to have these. And they're in GRD, so everyone can have easy access to them.
Awesome. AM?
Yes, hello, Daniel. Thank you very much for this. It is very timely with Veterans Day coming up. I actually have two distinct questions. The first question is, what about post-World War II regimental histories? And are those things we're still acquiring? And yes, that's the
That's a
first
really,
question.
do you mind if I answer the first one first? That's
Yes,
a
of
really
course.
cool question. And I think it's a really interesting highlight of just American culture in general, of how World War I and World War II are really really heroic. Even though, World War I, there were people burning German books in Wisconsin. I think we can have more introspection on that. Definitely by the time you hit Vietnam, um, I need to read more about the NYPL's history in that. But the fact that there isn't a marker to the Vietnam War in the NYPL really shows wider cultural shifts of how that war is viewed in America's culture. I know we do have extensive holdings on Vietnam, but I don't think that I feel World War II was even just like at the Schomburg Center with the Centennial, there's a beautiful exhibit of um, their collection of African American letters of African American soldiers in World War II, and that public emphasis uh, really starts to taper off as we get closer to today.
Mm, indeed. My second question is, what was the number one issue related to researching NYPL at the NYPL? Any problems or issues you had?
I am so grateful for the NYPL Retirees Oral History Project. I've consulted them on some research of Alice Hudson, and they've been really, really helpful with their time. And it's through their generosity that so much of our institutional memory is safeguarded. Um, I do hope for a day when we can have more access like an institutional archivist. I'm also so grateful for especially local history and the manuscripts and archives division for their help with my research. They wear so many hats and really helped. But then even again with finding this postcard as a bookmark of it's a NYPL staff member writing about his World War II experiences. I let people know, and they kind of said, "Well, we don't really have an archivist yet, so just hold on to it until we figure out something." So my mission is before I leave the library or retire or whatever, hopefully that's many years away, that I find a proper home for this. But right now it's on my desk. And if any of you have a better home, let me know.
Thank you, Daniel.
And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand or to pop into the chat. But I guess, Daniel, I have a question, which is when you were going through this extensive set of collections, was there any favorites that you personally had?
Oh, like all of them. I'm also really grateful to public programming because I was able to do a Friday talk and I had as many books as I could fit in that in 216. I had a little display. Um, I I love the funny little pictures of really also just the use of photography in World War II really blossomed. If you look at regimental histories from World War I would say poetry is the most raw medium that people use to convey their grief and their emotions. And while there's still poetry in World War II, um, the medium of photography really comes into blossom. So the books that were meant for internal use, with even with soldiers who weren't supposed to have a camera but did, and then shared those pictures, those are absolute gems. And then, of course, any documentation of hope by people who are in prison camps. That if I could do an exhibit, it would be creative works by people who are in jail, and I think that would be someday that would be an amazing exhibit.
Thank you. Stephen?
Hey, this is incredible, very powerful. And I'm curious, like, what do you see as the future when you have text messaging, smartphones, and letter writing is sort of not really a thing of just something that doesn't hardly ever happen anymore. And the whole idea of how we share common experiences has changed. How does an institution um, monitor and collect these kind of more fleeting aspects of experience?
Oh, that is such a good question, and I'm probably the least qualified to answer. I know there's other people who would be better. One thing I want to say, or I know that NYPL does some amazing stuff too, but one thing I'm really inspired by is Columbia University has a program for like endangered, it's like human rights journalism where they're really going and scraping metadata from like, think of a newspaper in Hong Kong or dissident writing in Russia and really trying to highlight and gather the ephemeral and safeguarding it while it's destroyed. And even if I went on a recap trip and I saw Columbia's archives, they're one of the world's greatest collections of Tiananmen Square ephemera, which even though it's not text messaging, ephemeral, think of a poster put up in Beijing in 1989. And that mission is so inspiring. The Syrian archive is also another place I really admire of people who with AI. I'm sorry, I missed the AI panel. I still need to be fully converted that this is an amazing thing. But AI was automatically deleting all this human rights documentation from the war in Syria. And as a response, people were trying to save as much YouTube content as possible so it could be used as evidence for war crimes. So we do see some creative, amazing work, but it's a major battle. And especially, I'm curious, like with the bird collection, what will the bird collection look like in 100 years when we won't have, T.S. Eliot's poem written in blood, or no, was it T.S. Eliot or Auden who had a poem that he wrote in blood that's in Berg? But anyway, that will look different. I also do think, especially with my generation, there is people are just sick of oversharing online sometimes. So I have one or two friends that we write handwritten letters, and it might be one or two a year, but I hope there's a swing back um, towards the analog.
Yeah, thank you.
Ready. We have time for one or two more questions. If anyone has another question, feel free to pop in the chat, raise your hand. But in the interim, I have another question, Daniel. I always have a question. So you were talking about how photography, like for even people not supposed to have a camera, Sometimes they would take pictures and then they'll end up in these histories. So I was wondering if have you explored finding regimental histories in other formats? I'm wondering, with like the Peter Jackson documentaries where they have like film during World Wars, and photo restoring them do regimental histories come in other formats besides like pamphlets as well?
Definitely. I know the map division has some gems that I need to fully explore, especially humorous maps. There's definitely material there as well. And definitely regimental histories look different now today of, thinking of like group chats and text messages and Facebook albums, depending on the day and age. I really do, um, yeah, World War II was such a special moment where people had the foresight to gather all of this material together and really document it. And we see how that's been the seed for scholarship and remembrance to this day.
Thank you. And so, if anyone has any last questions, feel free. I will say there are a number of really interesting links that are being put in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance, please do click on them. They're really, really interesting and really informative in conjunction with Daniel's talk. But once again, just want to say thank you to Daniel for a wonderful presentation. And I hope everyone enjoyed their Research Libraries Conference experience this year. Thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Thank you all, especially for after so many rich conferences to stick out for this last session. I'm grateful you joined.
Way to close it out, Daniel.